It is Thursday, July 13th. Welcome to Axiom News Live, where we engage strengths to catalyze change, where we start with what's strong rather than what's wrong. Here, we draw attention to people whose work in the world we become connected to and to care about. Today, we are joined by Sean Loney of Encompass Co-op, a member of our news collaborative. Sean and I will co-host our conversation today. We also have Lawrence Lewis, who is founder of One Feather, an indigenous technology company that is planting the seeds of sovereignty in a digital era. And David Patton, a colleague and friend who is launching a publishing house to elevate the voices of those with lived and living experience of drug recovery. Let's invite Sean and Lawrence and David to join the stream. Welcome, Sean, Lawrence, and David. Good to see you all. Good day.
Nice to see everyone. This is awesome.
And thanks for joining us. Yeah. Let's jump right in with why it was you said yes to our invitation. Sean, you've not only joined as co-host today, but through Encompass, you've also joined as one of the founding members of the Axiom News Media Collaborative. So maybe we invite you to say a little bit about why you said yes to either one or both of those invitations, and then we'll hear from Lawrence and David.
Well, I'm a big fan of Axiom News. I think we need a new narrative that's somewhere in between the two really bad options that are usually being proposed around trying to deal with problems. And I think it's not a solution that's halfway in between. It's something that takes what's right about both of those pitches and pushes them forward. It's usually something that's based in community.
Mm.
It's usually something that has an entrepreneurial bent. So you kind of connect those two things together, and I think that's where my headspace is at.
Right on.
And
okay.
I invited Lawrence to come today from One Feather. As listeners know, I do a lot of work with Aki Foods. Aki Foods works in the Island Lake region of Manitoba and other places, but there are no banks there, the 4 Ojibwe First Nations. And so people get their social assistance checks or their checks from their employer, and they go to the Northern store and cash the check. Northern store is a monopoly retailer. We think that monopoly retailer earns about $250,000 a year in fees, and kind of forces people to shop there. So
okay.
I wanted to bring Lawrence on and say, there's an indigenous way of doing this with an indigenous company, and it's awesome. So I'm looking forward to having that conversation today.
All right, great. Thanks, Sean. And Lawrence, why did you say yes?
Well, yeah, thank you. Why did I say yes? Sean asked me to. I had the opportunity to meet him in his offices a few weeks back, and great to meet his team, and really loved the energy and what they're up to. And so, yeah, I immediately said, yeah, I'd love to. Any opportunity for us to come out and talk a bit about what we do and why we do it in terms of lifting up Indigenous people and creating a new way of thinking and kind of reimagining this digital space that we live in from an Indigenous owned and managed perspective, I think is really important. And how do we facilitate change? How do we act on reconciliation? How do we as an Indigenous company take action to be the change that we want to see happen from that Indigenous perspective, that lens and our shared lived experience, and from the nuance or the parlance of the house of big house where I come from. Let's leave that table better set than the way we found it. Let's lift each other up in the business transactional world, not be extractive and try to take and tear each other down. So any opportunity to advance that impact, that legacy, that work with good people and good partners and allies and Indigenous communities across the country, across Turtle Island, sign me up. I'm going to say yes every time. So
Right
appreciate
on.
the invitation today. Thank you.
All right, thanks. And in the green room, we already sort of waded into a conversation about sovereignty and what all that means. So who knows? Maybe that will come up a little bit down the road too. Hey, all right. And David, You're coming in from across the Atlantic. It's 7 o'clock at night in your part of the world. Why a yes at such a late hour?
Hi, great to be here. And yeah, joining from Sheffield in England. And I joined really because I've worked with yourself and Yvonne in the past on a number of different projects. And when you shared the vision for Axiom News Live, I was just so blown away by the aims and the intentions. Um, and for me, whenever something is about connecting and creating community and collaboration, I'm in all the time. So that's why I'm here today.
Right on. Okay, great. Thank you, David. So why don't we just jump in? Our format for today is we'll spend 15 or 20 minutes spending our, not spending, but being attentive to and holding intention for hearing from and learning about Lawrence's work in the world. So we'll all put ourselves in service to that exploration for 15 or 20 minutes. And then we'll have a quick break, and then we'll shift our focus as a group to the work that David is doing. And then towards the end, we'll do a closing round of reflection. So, Sean, you said a little bit about why Lawrence and why you invited him to join. Do you have anything more to say about why, or perhaps even why now?
Yeah, so Aki Foods is looking for some kind of solution, and One Feather came up. But to be honest, I told Lawrence this, that I thought, oh, this is just like an indigenous group that is going to do this monopoly retailer approach kind of the same way. I feel really badly that was my first thought about it, but then I met Lawrence and One Feather, and it's like, wow, they're one of us. This is super cool. But before we get to One Feather, Lawrence, I think it's key with Axiom to tell us a bit about who you are. What do you think our listeners would want to know about your journey and who you are?
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity, and Sean for making all this happen for us, and to come in and talk a bit about One Feather and who we are and why we do what we do. I'm from the Wee-Way-Kay Nation on Vancouver Island here. My indigenous name is Glalis, and I'm had the good fortune my whole career of working with indigenous communities for the last 35 plus years. And largely in a capacity to help facilitate or lead change within those communities. So sometimes as a band manager, sometimes as an executive director, or as a director of economic development or something like that. I even spent a couple of years with the province of BC as a special advisor to the deputy minister, helping facilitate collaborative change around education and education agreements. And even also spent a year with the AFN as a special advisor as well. Through it all, it's really just been about creating a space and a place for indigenous communities to exercise sovereignty and ownership and control over their destinies. And we can frame that in any number of ways in terms of how we define that. But at the end of the day, it's about indigenous people being the change and leading the change that they want to be, that they want to see and what they want to feel, and doing it in a way that reflects that indigenous lens and our shared lived experience. And so there are so many nations across the country who so how we do that has to be reflective of each one of those groups and the uniqueness of their indigenous, histories and lived experience and cultures and dynamics and realities and all those kinds of things. And how do we do that? I think we do that with care and with kindness and with love and with respect and gratitude and every opportunity to lift each other up. And so when I think about, why does One Feather exist? Why do I do the work that I do? I try to frame it in the impact that we deliver at the end of the day. As a company, we're a for-profit enterprise, but as a company, our central line, that bottom line, if you like, is what's the impact we're delivering here? And from an indigenous perspective, does that impact lift people up? Does that impact leave the table better set than we found it? Does that impact create wealth? Does that impact rejoice and celebrate our indigenous identity? Does that impact build stronger communities? It cannot be extractive. And so when I think about, as I grew up in my indigenous community and was, and raised as a commercial fisherman, I spent most of my life as a commercial fisherman. I mean, the first part of my life as a commercial fisherman, very extractive commercial enterprise when you think about it, the impacts on the environment. But that was a teaching ground and a learning ground for me with my grandfather and my father and my aunties and my uncles. And that's where I really it was impressed upon me that as an indigenous person and as a man, I will come into this world with some privilege, and I need to take that privilege and use it in a way that helps our people and lifts our people up. And that was really core to the teachings of my grandfather and the elders and the people that I've spent my life with. Enjoy the work, do the heavy lifting, do the hard work, enjoy it, and make sure that it has impact and makes a difference, right? Everything else will take care of itself if you can find peace and happiness and joy in doing some heavy lifting in service to others, right?
Peter, Peter's going to want to jump in here. But, we got to tell the viewers too. You're a baseball coach.
Yeah, I coach my son's baseball team, and I'm family, right? Finding that right balance with family and your wife and partner. You've got to look after all of those things that you've planted, right? And be attentive to all those things. And same there, right? Like always be present with your youngsters and your partner, and try to live the best life you can in a good way, right? And invest in all of those things that keep your heart full and your mind solid and your spirit happy, right? Yeah.
So let me set the scene then. Garden Hill First Nation. I've been there a lot. Aki Foods is a 13-acre farm. It's a remote community. You have to fly into it. Oja Cree. There's about 6,000 people live there. There's no bank. So this is the context. Aki Foods has healthy food markets there, but people generally have to go to the northern store to cash their check. So the check gets cashed. There's the northern store will say, here's $200. The rest goes onto a We card. It's a prepaid credit card, basically. And it's $5 a month to have the card. It's $4 a month or so to load the card. It's $2.50 every time you check the balance. And what we need is a solution that will return some sort of sovereignty to how money moves in the community. So tell us, Lawrence, what One Feather, when we approach you with this issue, how you feel One Feather can respond, and then we'll get into how it is you're going to go about doing that.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. I'm going to take us just back just a couple of steps and make really clear that, look, we're a digital technology company, indigenous technology company. So how can we use these technologies, these evolving technologies, not only in terms of the fintech space, but in digital credentials and even AI? How can we take these technologies and reimagine them? This is the key thing here. Reimagine how we design, build, and deploy these things for the benefit and interests of our people in our community, right? And so let's find those spaces that are out there now that are extractive, that just suck the wealth out of our communities and in many respects keep us down, right? How can we reimagine those spaces with these new technologies and these new things to do away with cultural misrepresentation, to heighten data sovereignty, to remove the digital divide, to create stronger, more vibrant communities? How do we reimagine all of those interactions, all those interfaces, and replace those systems which either by accident or design continue to marginalize, isolate, discriminate, or oppress our people, right? Let's just get rid of that stuff. It doesn't need to be there. I'm a firm believer that none of that stuff needs to be there. We have enough power, enough resource, enough capacity, enough intelligence, enough resilience to make all of these changes, and it's just a willingness to do the work to make it happen. And so when we look at this banking space, how can we reimagine that? And what are the building blocks we need to put in place to reimagine how that interface can benefit our people? And so One Feather has taken a look at that, and we've gone down a lot of slippery slopes and done a lot of heavy lifting around blockchain and distributed ledger technologies and machine learning and AI and all these kinds of things to make sure that foundationally we have an understanding of how these technologies can work so that we can, when we do decide to deploy them, we can do it in a good way. But what is the fundamental piece that allows us to transition away from these archaic and antiquated processes and relationships? And you've used this example of the Northern Store. Well, what the approach we've taken, and there may be other approaches here, but the approach we've taken is to focus around the development and creation of an indigenous sovereign digital credential, right? Where we use multiple sources of truth. Could be the federal government, could be your First Nation, could be the banking solution we create for you, could be a voting event, could be any number of interactions where we go through a process what we call KYC, or know your customer, or some verification process, where we can create a number of credentials or digital verifications of your identity that result in this digital credential. And that digital credential can then be used to unlock other entitlements, benefits, services much more rapidly and at less of a transactional cost. So for example, with One Feather, when you're inside our ecosystem, so when I say inside our ecosystem, you've gone through the digital credentialing process with us, and there's any number of ways to do that. And it sounds like a big thing, but it's not. It's like 3 or 4 minutes of your time and you're good to go, right?
So for you, Lawrence, when you got your digital credential with One Feather, because I'm sure you have done that, what did you use to get that digital credential?
So yeah, you can use a piece of ID, you can use a passport, you can use a guarantor. So I say you can use that interaction with your First Nation. Somebody knows you explicitly, and they would execute a guarantor on your behalf. That's one. So we require at least 2 points initially, at least 2 points of digital verification or identity verification to issue that credential, right? So at least 2 trusted sources. And we'll guide you through that process. Like it's not hocus pocus stuff when you come in, and we'll walk you through what those options are. It's similar.
And if I'm going to go take out a bank account, I have to, they want to verify my identity, but you're doing this in a digital space, and
exactly.
Also accepting Indigenous, like First Nation credentials.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, you can't get around you have to figure out a way to get through the regulatory requirements, particularly in banking. Like you can't just ignore them. It doesn't work that way. But how can we reimagine that interface with in a digital space where that credentialing happens really quickly and really easily? So once you've gone through that with us, you're in our ecosystem, the act of actually getting a digital bank account just takes you a few extra steps. Like literally in 5 minutes, you're done. You have a digital bank account. You've created a bank account without ever having set foot in a bank, right? You can do it from the comfort of your coffee table or at your coffee table on a Sunday morning if you wish. You can create that digital bank account. Of course, we have an app that goes along with it, so you have to download the app and all that kind of good stuff. But now you are banked. You are effectively banked. And if you want to link that bank with that digital bank account with a traditional bank, like say you bank at BMO or TD, you can do that. And you can move money around in all the same ways you would with any kind of traditional bank. So the technology delivery is the same, but inside of our ecosystem, there are benefits, right? Moving money within our ecosystem doesn't cost anything. So you can move money around, you can share money, you can distribute money. When a nation moves money from them to the member, there's no cost in that transaction, right? If the member buys something at a nation store, for example, there would be a reduced transactional cost. Now we have partnerships with our partners that kind of also drive down external transactional costs. So once you've gone through that process and created that digital bank account, you can just use your phone to tap and pay as you would any other kind of, like a Apple Pay or anything like that. So in that respect, it feels the same. Or you can order a bank card, right? You can get a debit or a prepaid credit card, looks something like that. So if you're of my generation and you don't feel whole unless you have another piece of plastic in your wallet, we can satisfy that. But if you're of my son's generation, you don't want plastic. You just want to be able to tap and go, right? So once we've done that, once we get you banked, and then you're dealing with a lower maintenance cost, a lower transactional cost. The cost of being banked is driven right down, like by several multiples, right? So now it's easier to stay banked, right? And if inside of our ecosystem, there's no transactions happening, there's no cost to maintain your existence. So it's not like this, you have to maintain this, month after month fee to maintain this thing. It's only there are costs, because of course we need to pay for the technology and build up this stuff, but there are costs there, but the idea is to drive those costs down by several multipliers, and also incorporate elements that are interesting and beneficial to First Nations and their members. So things like, when it comes time to renew your status card, it's just a click and you renew your status card and you're done. Say you're using that bank card to shop at a particular location and you're eligible for GST or HST exemption. That exemption just happens at point of sale. You don't need to self-declare. You don't need to fill out a form. You don't need to sign anything. Those transactions just happen because that's an entitlement that you're benefit for. So when we talk about removing the barriers, removing those friction points, let's just take those things all out of play. You have as an Indigenous person, you have a special relationship with Canada in this country and with your First Nation and with provincial governments. You have entitlements and benefits that you have a right to access. Now, granted, over the years, these processes become really antiquated, they're paper driven, and the very nature of them create barriers for you to access, right? No, that stuff's all got to go. That stuff's got to get kicked out. Let's reimagine these from a digital space so that you can access those without having to do any of that kind of stuff. And we have a number of direct pay solutions, and one of them will roll out with Canada later this year, or early next year at least, is around treaty annuity payments. So if you're entitled to a treaty annuity payment and you're inside our ecosystem and you want to receive it, bang, you just get it when it's released. You don't need to show up someplace and prove you're Indian. You don't need to fill out a form. You don't need to request it. It just happens, right? And so when we think about redefining that economic reality for Indigenous people, let's leave more on the table. Probably about.
That feels, Lawrence, like it would really change your experience of your relationship with the system.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like it seems like you've opened gateways to it being so that each individual feels a little bit more in control of the situation than being in constant lineups, being at different offices, encountering those institutions on a regular basis. Absolutely. I'm wondering, I think I read that One Feather was founded in 2014.
Correct.
And you're now serving something like 270 different communities.
Yes.
What are the kinds of changes you've seen in communities and in people's individual lives as you've been able to bring this on stream? We're talking 7.
Yeah.
How many years is that? I'm not even gonna do the math, but
10
it's a lot of years. So you must have seen
10
some
years.
change in that time.
Oh yeah.
And what are the stories like?
Yeah, it's interesting because pre-COVID, it was we love the technology. We're really excited, but we're not sure if we're ready, right? And then COVID hit, and then post-COVID, it was like we love the technology. We want it now, right?
Right.
So even in some respects, that whole experience, I think, accelerated the adoption of these technologies. And of course, once they're adopted and you experience the impact of those in a good way, right? There's in Indian country in Canada, there's that Moxon telegraph. Word spreads pretty quick, right? That this is a good thing, and so I think we've allowed our people to tell the story around how these technologies can have a positive impact. We did over 24,000 status card applications last year alone, right? Just because it's simpler, it's faster, it's easier, it's cheaper, right? And we actually have a human interface with you, where if, in the other processes, there's no human interaction. There's no human element to it. It's purely transactional and oftentimes traumatizing and problematic.
Absolutely.
So absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's wonderful. And I think our people have always been early adopters. When you look at the stats and you do the history and you do the research, our people have always been early adopters, and I would argue that that's allowed us to survive hundreds of years of colonial impact and oppression, right? That we've been able to adapt very quickly from a survival and a longevity perspective. So, my grandfather would say, what's the root word of ingenuity? It's an engine, right? And you got to have a good sense of humor in Indian country. So, he'd have gems like that all the time, right? So. Yeah, our people are strong and resilient, and given the opportunity to participate in a good way, they're onto that 100% for sure.
Right on.
We want our listeners to know when they tune into Axiom Live, 2 p.m. Eastern, every single Thursday. It's an hour of feeling good. It's an hour of positive things are happening. And I think with One Feather, I'm certainly feeling the Axiom vibe right now. Talk to us a bit, Lawrence, about sovereignty. What is One Feather? How do you see Indigenous sovereignty or sovereignty of communities as far as that goes?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, and it's one we continue to explore, right, and try to understand from that Indigenous perspective. One of my mentors was Chief Bobby Joe, and he said to me, "Look, we don't pretend to have the answers, but go out there and make space for the conversation. Be a digital warrior." He framed it as be a digital warrior. Go out there and test the boundaries and understand what this space looks like, and then bring that learning and experience back to the communities and our people, and let's figure it out together in terms of what that looks like, right? But sovereignty, when we talk about sovereignty and from a colonial perspective or a crown perspective, sovereignty is about, it's the idea that data is subject to the laws and governance structures of the nations that have collected it, right? But from a First Nations perspective, or Indigenous communities have a distinct cultural views around data collection, storage, dissemination, and sharing, right? So, and for many Indigenous cultures, that knowledge is considered communal rather than individual property. So what does that look like from a sovereignty perspective, from an Indigenous lens perspective? And go out there and help figure that stuff out, right? Because you are not, from a really simple definition of sovereignty, you're not sovereign unless you own the data and you have, or think about data, but sovereignty in general, you're not unless you own it and you have possession of it, right? If you have owned something but someone else possesses it, you're not sovereign, right? You're subject to the crown or you're subject to something else. So those two elements are important. How do we reimagine or define those from an Indigenous perspective? I think is important. And I think, we're all about having that conversation and discovering that along the way. And granted, we're going to make some mistakes. My grandfather would say, don't ever be afraid to make a mistake. I'm not sure how else you learn. So go out there and do some things, make some mistakes, learn from them, and build upon those experiences and share that story with our people and take their guidance when they offer it, for sure.
What's burbulating now, Lawrence? You've been on this path for a while. What seems to be emerging and unfolding in the near term and in the near future?
Yeah, I think AI. So
All
talk
right.
about digital impacts, or AI. Oh my goodness, it's all happening so quickly, right? We're barely just getting our head around what the digital impacts would be, and now we've got to deal with things like AI. And the risk around AI is there's a cultural appropriation, biased algorithms, exclusion from decision making. I mean, the impacts here are huge, and I think we're just starting to understand them. And the challenge, I think, the risk I see is that it just may be happening so quickly that we're consumed by it. We won't have time to properly adapt, and we'll be forced to react and always be in catch up. So if there are things that keep me awake at night, it's the impact of these things on our people and our identity and our way of life and those values and principles, right? Like in terms of what defines us as being Indigenous.
As you're confronted with what you're seeing there, what is it that you'd like to experience in a community while you push the boundaries and host the conversations to find the response?
Well, I think just a willingness to engage and have a conversation about it, right? And
Right.
and build an understanding about it, right? Like the reality is if you don't take ownership and possess a will to change here, something's going to happen that's going to force change upon you. And nations, many First Nations are often just in a constant state of crisis and survival. They don't have time to think about what's the impact of tomorrow. We just need to get through today. And I think these are bigger questions and issues. I think that government and other partners need to think about how we create space for our First Nations to be ready and to engage in the impacts of digital technologies, but also AI and whatever is coming in the future. I mean, we would not have thought about what's the impact of AI. I think we just started to think about it maybe 10 years ago, and now in the last year we're like, oh my God, it's happening. What are we going to do? So I think I don't have I speculate. I don't have the answers there. It's such heavy lifting for First Nations, and I'm loath to say you must do this because I know, they're worried about putting roofs over people's heads and food and fridges.
It also strikes me that it's not a conversation everyone is in a position to have. One, if you're still working through trauma and we're always in a crisis mode, then it's not a conversation for everyone.
Exactly.
But there are those who are in a position to have that conversation. Who could you imagine inviting to a circle to have that conversation in your community?
Oh, we have a podcast series, so we're inviting people to talk about
Brilliant.
that stuff every couple of weeks. And so we invite elders, we invite activists, we invite politicians, we invite business entrepreneurs.
Is that all publicly to be found, or is it in
is.
a closed community, or could we point people to
Oh,
what you've got going on there?
I put the link in our chat bar there.
Brilliant.
So
Okay.
we've just done 6 episodes. We recorded 8, so it takes us a while to produce them post production, or post interview. But the whole focus on that was to talk about what are the impacts here and how are we navigating them, and let's start to create space for the conversation, right, so that others can participate and hear what's happening. And to your point exactly, that there are many that are just not ready, prepared, or necessarily need to have the conversation right now because of other priorities and other important things that they need to be healthy and happy and all those kinds of good things. Maybe it's family, maybe it's coaching your son's baseball team. I don't know, but there are.
I happen to
folks
think
out
it makes a
there.
heck of a lot of sense that a response to an overwhelming AI is human conversation and connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and
So
we're
real about that.
we're in better shape because One Feather is a player in the field than we are without it. Also, want to break some news right now. Lawrence, we met with Garden Hill First Nation this morning, Chief and Council,
Nice.
led by Darcy Wood, the former Chief of Garden Hill First Nation,
Oh, yeah.
the
Okay. Yeah.
CEO of Aki Foods, and
Yeah. Wonderful.
I am happy to report here live that they are really pumped to get going with One Feather, and we'll be reaching out shortly to tee that up.
Awesome.
It's exciting on multiple fronts.
I'd love to come back out.
Amazing.
Is there up the summertime? Is there good fishing in the summertime, Sean?
We can take it fishing for sure.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well,
Your fish might be a little bigger than their fish.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Who's taking who?
I'll bring some sockeye out and we'll do an exchange. An exchange. We'll figure out what the protocol is and we'll do some good work there as well for sure. Yeah.
And I do enjoy your podcast. It's awesome. It's
Awesome.
worth listening.
Thank you. Right on.
And there it is in the
Thank you.
what do you call it? In the ticker. All right, that's beautiful. Thank you, Lawrence, very much for joining us. And I would love to continue this conversation. I'm sure a lot of people would also love to be part of that. So hopefully we can have you back and certainly track with what you've got going on with One Feather and with your podcast. So thank you
Awesome.
very
Feel like
much.
this one. Thanks.
Okay. So with that, we're going to take a quick break. Yvonne, if you want to cue up our musical interlude. And every 2 weeks, we host something called Cultivating Community. That's a free space for people to come and connect and practice relational presencing and create, discover possibilities that aren't obvious when we begin. So we'll take a quick break with that, and then we'll hear from David.
If you would like to experience genuine connection with others, being heard, patience, levity and laughter, warmth, light, smiles, new, deepening, and healing relationships, then cultivate community with us. Coined by participants as a fortnightly feast for the soul, these 90-minute gatherings hosted by Axiom News offer a weaving of small group dialogue led by carefully crafted questions, followed by light, whole group reflection. Each dialogue round deepens connection and enlivens possibility between and amongst those who participate. All are welcome. Learn more and RSVP for our next gathering by visiting the Events tab in Anew Commons, our sister initiative in Mighty Networks, at anewcommons.mn.co/events.
All right, wonderful. Dr. David Patton of the University of Derby and many other things. We've had the pleasure of knowing each other for 2 or 3 years or so now. Our original connection was through your work with the Recovery Pathways Research Team. And through that, we held a number of public events with folks in the UK and from around the world to share some of the findings and I understand through the research you're very much honoring the voices of people with lived and living experience with recovery. And we were also involved in some fantastic co-production activity to bring some of the voices forward. And I understand that you were able to present some of your findings and work at the United Nations not that long ago.
Right.
I've not met anyone that's been there, so I'm just kind of wondering what was that like?
It was very surreal. It was a real honor.
Surreal, okay, yeah.
It's kind of that pinch yourself moment where you're kind of stood in the courtyard and surrounded by the 139 flags from all the countries that are represented there. And I presented on some of the work that yourself, Navon and I did as part of that project. And really that was the kind of the kairos, the connection point of that project with a presentation I was giving on stigma. So all of my work is around working with people in addiction recovery, and also kind of people who are turning away from life of crime and desisting from crime. And so I was presenting a paper on stigma at the United Nations. And, as I was writing the paper, preparing to write, it was the usual academic thing of PowerPoint and statistics. And isn't it awful? Isn't it awful? It's so bad. The barriers and all the stats are really depressing. And I kind of deleted the file. And I thought, I'm not going to retell that depressing narrative. And so I kind of created the new narrative, and from that, connecting back to the project that we did, exploring recovery pathways, came the idea to birth the kind of publishing house that we'll talk about a bit later. Yeah, but it was a great experience, and just a real surreal moment of seeing all of the countries, all of the ministers from the different governments from around the world debating drug policy and what needs to happen next in drug policy. And it was a real privilege to be there, a real eye-opener of what's occurring globally.
One of the things I enjoyed about the Recovery Pathways work and connecting the dots to what you were finding through your research to lived experience, I think really made things a lot simpler and clearer. Mm-hmm. And one of the key elements in the work was that no one's journey is the same.
Yes.
That there is no one answer or no one path, and there's a variety of capitals at work. And
yes, and that came out very strongly. So Professor David Best, who's a real global innovator in this area, and his research that was exploring the different pathways across Europe with a team of other researchers. And it was 4-country kind of study in England, Scotland, Belgium, and Netherlands. And they did a survey, thousands of people in recovery, exploring what experiences, what pathways they'd used and what had worked for them in recovery. And that was a clear finding that actually this trying to homogenize or advocate this is the way is absolutely the wrong way to try and support and empower people in recovery. Because what we found was that the whole range of mechanisms and a whole myriad of different assets and approaches that we used, and people almost come with their own pick and mix approach. And that's what's unique about that recovery journey, that it is that individualized, personalized, nuanced journey. And yes, there are some commonalities. So when we spoke about
some patterns,
there's some patterns and some common pathways, but nonetheless, the specific ingredients are still unique. So even though we found that connection and hope, cultivating a new sense of identity, discovering kind of new meaningful kind of activities, but moreover a deeper sense of purpose about your life and your skills and strengths, and feeling empowered compared to feeling hopeless, were some common elements to the journeys. There was still a whole multiplicity of additional ingredients that made up that pathway for that individual.
Right. Yeah. In that journey, we ran into a fellow by the name of Peter Sherrod, and I don't know whether he actually sparked the conversation, but you and I also recorded a podcast about a year ago where we borrowed, or at least I did, from Peter Sherrod's idea that people who have experience with addiction, he would say, aren't bad people.
Yes.
But they've been harmed by society. They're harmed by the culture they grew up in. And so the culture we grow up in is the problematic question. And we ended up in conversations about decolonizing and sovereignty over your experience and your journey in life. And so he would speak of having to peel back much of that programming and the revisiting of trauma that every encounter with the system that's supposed to heal you is actually reinforcing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, so I also understand, sorry, go ahead.
Go finish.
I understand you might be coming to Ottawa, so you might be flying across the Atlantic and visiting us here.
Mid-September.
Mid-September, all right.
I'm so excited.
Yeah. And I imagine,
Peter, I wanted to just jump in there. I'm in Winnipeg, David, and it's a pleasure to meet you. I feel like we're at the beginning of a paradigm shift where we're leaving behind this idea that there's something wrong with people who are homeless or people who are poor, and we're understanding that they're, the issue is the systems, as Peter's saying. So, um, so government is actually part of the context of setting these systems. What's your main advice to government in terms of providing a space for customized, holistic supports for people who, through very little fault of their own, have ended up in circumstances that aren't ideal?
Yeah, big question, complex answer, but I think you're absolutely right around. So the narrative, the dominant narrative, typically individualizes and responsibilizes the person, and you would kind of, you'd have this expert who comes in, traditionally a medical expert, with their kind of positivistic kind of knowledge base, and they would look at the person, at their defects and their risk factors, and they'd be looking to apply their kind of medical expert knowledge to treat and diagnose what is the problem, or what are the problems here. And typically they'll be looking with that individual lens. What occurred in their childhood? Was there sexual abuse, neglect, poverty, so on and so forth? The whole range of kind of life course experiences that individual has had that is perhaps distinct to the person who's not in addiction. And of course, there are some findings that those things have a significant detrimental impact. But that's only part of the narrative, because actually when you zoom out, as both yourself and Peter have mentioned, there are these macro structural factors that are absolutely more potent than the individual factors. And maybe, or more likely, some of those individual experiences are a direct result of those structural global factors being in place. And so for me, in the research that I've done, what I've found is actually when you look at coloniality as a huge force still operating within, the globalized world. And a lot of people think about colonialism, about the occupied physical rule of a nation over another one. But actually, when you talk about coloniality, that's something a bit different. There, we're talking about this matrix of power, which is about the underlying logic or systems or structures. And typically, coloniality would encompass things like control over knowledge, how we create knowledge, and how we kind of produce knowledge. That has been dominated this. And so then any other way, an indigenous form of knowledge or a communal form of knowledge, a lived experience form of knowledge, is therefore invalid, inferior, subordinate to this medical model or this scientific model of knowledge. You've also got kind of control over authority. So it's created the state, the government. And that is then this kind of paternalistic kind of savior, that the government will then have all of the answers. It will protect you and provide for you, but only if you abide by its rules. And if you don't, then you'll be punished. So there's also control over the economy and the whole capitalist neoliberal kind of structures that have further fragmented that community life and living and connection, and the diverse range of languages and rituals and ceremonies. They've all been kind of become subservient to this driving force of profit. And then there's also the control over kind of subjectivities about how you kind of sense and be within your own self. That's only certain people have that authority to kind of tell you how you think or feel. So it's quite complex. So in terms of coming back to your question, it's quite difficult to advise the government in many respects because they reproduce the problem. The infrastructure of the state itself is predicated upon the foundations of coloniality. So it's quite hard, and what you often get within the arena is, let's have some reform. Let's put some band-aids onto a system or structures that are broken, that don't work. But a band-aid isn't sufficient. It needs a radical restructuring. And that's what my research is really kind of uncovering, that when you listen to communities who, and I don't like using this language, but just for shorthand, traditionally marginalized communities, that their envisioning of the world that they want to inhabit can't occur if the impact of coloniality is still sovereign. And so I think what's great about the work of Lawrence is that he's creating that alternative. He's showing that there's another way. Here's a possibility for a different system and a different structure. Because I think a lot of people are quite passively accepting or not happy to moan about, but continue to kind of critique or get angry about the system and the state and the government. And we can be here for another 1,000 millennia, critiquing and getting angry at the injustices of what's being reproduced. And it won't change a thing. It'll just have a detrimental impact on our health.
So you, David, you're also, given the difficulty in advising others to change,
Yes.
and, I've heard recently that waiting for someone else to change doesn't seem like a very powerful path to transformation. But you're stepping in and you're beginning a new publishing house with a view to, you talked earlier about the way we create knowledge, the way we shape narratives, who owns that, who produces that.
Yep.
So let's talk about this publishing house that you are launching. Why now, and maybe a little bit about it.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, and as I said, it was kind of that merger between the project that you and I and Yvonne worked on, the recovery pathways, and those meetings were so distinct because the ingredients of those meetings were so different to the other meetings that I would have in the rest of my week. The dynamics that were operating, the values, the beliefs, and the practices were so juxtaposed to the dynamics in other kind of meetings that I would have. And it really got me reflecting. There's something alive in this culture that isn't present in these other environments and contexts. And so it was when I was at the United Nations speaking on stigma, and before I went, I came across a Toni Morrison quote that really is the stimulus for the publishing house. And so for those that don't know Toni Morrison, I'm sure most people do, but a Black African-American writer who faced lots of barriers, discrimination, bias, oppression, and was often critiqued in her writing for focusing on the Black population in her books. And it was watching this kind of interview that she was having with somebody in the mainstream media, and this lady was very racist, and the blinkers of white privilege was clearly evident in her questioning towards Toni Morrison. And this lady had just asked this really racist question, maybe unintentionally, I think. And Toni Morrison just leans forward and she says, "My dear, I stood at the edge. I stood at the border and I claimed it as central. And I allowed the rest of the world to move over to where I was." And I thought, wow, that's exactly it. And so I've created the publishing house. It's called New Central Media. And at first, I don't know if you recall, Peter, when we had that first discussion, at first I was going to call it Margin Central Media. But
I don't remember that.
what I realized was that actually the narrative of the oppressor was evident in the title of the company. So that the notion of margin
right
was not going to have a presence in this publishing house. That's not what this publishing house is here to do. So I renamed it to New Central Media because what I'm about is creating the new center where everyone is included. And there's that plethora of knowledge bases of customs and ceremonies, and rituals and ways of knowing and being. And really that's at the heart of it. So, it is to elevate that lived experience knowledge base of people in recovery who faced addiction, and to showcase the potency of that knowledge, and to be a bridge really between the academic knowledge and the lived experience knowledge, and to put that together to really disseminate it. It is also to overcome stigma, because I want to build something that is the alternative to the traditional publishing company, because it's not about making a profit. It's not about encouraging consumption. It's actually about creating community and collaboration, empowerment and dissemination of a new narrative. It's about those things instead.
Mm.
David, David, you're in the UK. I'm in the center of Canada here. 5 of my 8 great-grandparents are from Scotland.
Oh, really?
And so I've been to Scotland a couple times researching social enterprises.
Right.
And I just found it intriguing. They tell it through a story. I got onto a bus in Glasgow and I was asking for directions, and I could not understand the bus driver. So there's a woman came from the back of the bus, and she interpreted, which was lovely, translated. And I sat down with her, and she says, "What are you doing here in Glasgow?" And I said, "Well, I'm studying social enterprises." And she says to me something I'll never forget. She says, "Oh, they're very civilized, aren't they?" So she knew what it was, and she knew it was a much different approach. And what we did to Lawrence's ancestors, and was the Scots that largely designed the residential school system here in Canada, because they had experienced it or witnessed what was done to them by their colonizers, the English.
Yes.
And so here we are leaning into these. In Winnipeg, we would see it as an Indigenous approach to things, human-based. We're putting a value on love and compassion. It's not an economic thing. It's just saying this is really important. This is really important things. And so we're going to have more about this with Axiom News in this slot, 2 p.m. Eastern on Thursdays, about an arrangement we're pitching to the Winnipeg Police right now, which is to say, look, make a list of people that are interacting with you regularly that are costing you $5,000 a month or more, and then agree to pay nonprofits $3,000 a month for every month you don't see them. And I think it creates a space to allow the David Patton knowledge of the world to go for it, to have the resources to customize the solutions that you need. And that human-centered, we would argue, Indigenous approach to how we go about creating a new narrative here.
Well, there's something about in the live experience recovery community that I noticed, and we've talked about this, David, that I found myself saying, we're all, maybe not all, but a heck of a lot of us are addicted to something.
Yes.
It could be consumerism, it could be power, it could be who knows what. And what we see as people work through their own experiences and are supported in that by community, that we see the strength and resilience of and the uniqueness of each individual, and that seems to be an antidote to much of what ails us in the larger context of society. So I really feel that your idea of new central media and shifting the locus of attention provides us a generative image of the future to which systems can orient.
Absolutely.
So I love this idea of placing what you're doing at the center rather than considering it alternative or marginalized. And Lawrence, you said earlier, I can't remember who you were quoting, an elder or chief or mentor said, well, what you'd like to do is indigenize everything. And this is the response to. So maybe with that, I'll invite you to respond to that, Lawrence. David, thank you very much for joining us. And I think we'll definitely reconnect again. We've got about 7 minutes left. I thought maybe we'd bring us all back into the whole circle and just see what's burbulating now, what's alive for you or what's touched you about what you've heard from others. And Lawrence, maybe I can invite you to start since we've had the microphone elsewhere for a while.
For sure. I love this term burbulating. I've never heard that before. So I'm gonna adopt that myself. Yeah.
Right
I was meeting with a gentleman named James Delorme on a podcast we recorded yesterday, and as a previous chief of the Kluhus First Nation and even a director with the BC Assembly of First Nations, he's, just came to the realization that, look, the narrative here around decolonization is already a narrative that is coming from the oppressors. So how do we look at this from an Indigenous lens and perspective? And that is, let's just, let's take in the Klus example, he said, let's just take our environment and make sure that we indigify that, or we create, through the Klahus lens. Let's just do that work.
Yeah.
And by the very nature of doing that work, the aspects of colonialization or the impacts or those things that are challenging us will melt away, because we'll just be so focused on being who we are and why we are, and those values and principles that are important to us, that those other impacts just won't be allowed to filter in or touch us. And so I thought that was brilliant, right? And good for him for having the the leadership and the insight and intellect and the space to do that and to make that happen. So I thought that was brilliant for sure.
And I think the work that we're all doing is around decentering those systems and structures. And language is really important to that, because the language still includes and puts them at the center. Even having to address or justify or say it's an alternative puts them at the center. Yeah. So I love that, Lawrence.
Oh, for sure. And
Well, I was
even the
going to
work
ask
we
you,
do.
David. You're a long ways away from Lawrence. What were you hearing when Lawrence was talking about One Feather?
Yeah, I loved it around just that empowerment of the community and stepping in to empower the community, but also to nullify the impact of an unjust system that was continuing to cause harm to the community. Yeah, I was very much hearing that and was saying bravo, kind of without wanting to interrupt. Yeah, really great work.
Yeah.
So much, so important.
And Lawrence, you're working at things from a very Indigenous perspective. And did you hear any of your ancestors' teachings and how David approaches his work?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a real powerful alignment there, right? I think when we all take the time to be reflective on those things that impact us, and I'd frame this as the ancestral voice, right? That there's always that wisdom that's available if you just stop and be quiet and listen, right? And so I think coming at it from a whole different perspective, right? To reimagine, what I hear here is just a reimagining of how things can be done, and to not be constrained or contained within, some other system that's defined for us. You have a lived experience, Sean and Peter and David and myself, and how can we reimagine the world through that? And then how do we take action to help bring space to that and create place for that, and do so from a place of love and kindness and generosity and respect, right? Let's build a world where we lift each other up instead of trying to tear each other down and be extractive and take away and or be slave to systems and systemic institutions or corporations or profit, that profit motivation, right? Like these things have a life of their own now. And I think we've let them run amok, and they can be pretty evil if we continue to let them do so.
Well, what a treat it's been to be together, David Patton from the University of Derby, and looking forward to your visit to Canada, and Lawrence Lewis from One Feather coming to us today from Victoria, BC. And I think a lot's happened here in this conversation. I wanted to remind listeners that we'll be back next week, Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern. I don't even know what time that is for you, David. Bedtime.
7 p.m. 7 p.m. in the UK.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So,
yes, sir.
One of the guests we'll have next week is Ryan from Tapestry Capital. Tapestry has raised over $100 million in community bonds largely for solar projects, and they're pushing into using that vehicle to raise money for supportive housing and for other housing projects. So tune in next week at 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll on our YouTube channel. We'll come at you live with that conversation and more. And some observations from today, talking about a new narrative. Both of you really presenting that new narrative, and the new narrative is really potent. That word came up about love and compassion and what love and compassion can do, and to replace the existing narrative where people are somehow defective. And isn't it wonderful, as Lawrence had said, to talk about Indian country and to really feel what that means, a place where we're removing barriers so we can see Indigenous ways of being and knowing and doing. And we're going to hear things more often like, you're banked, as part of this new narrative. And the system works great for me and my kids, my family. We just want a system that works well for everyone. That's really what we're on about. And when we reach that, I think it's about sovereignty and placing the solution in the center. And so to all of you, and especially to you, Peter, at Axiom News for hosting this conversation, It's been really good to be together, and we'll see you all again next week.
Thank you very much.
Well.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. Great to be here.
Be well.